Welcome to Poker Workout Wednesday number 3. For those of you new to this series, it's quite simple. Below me is a link to a PDF. You download the PDF, you read the assignment, and you discuss what you would do and why. We can have discussion about this below. I've been loving the discussion that's going on. There's like a 50 back and forth thread about what play is optimal. That is the whole point of this series, is to have intelligent, information-driven discussions about poker. Not just like, that's bad, that's stupid, that's not. I'm trying to facilitate that. So please remember, also, when you post your comment below, understand that this assignment, Poker Workout Wednesday, number 3, is what would you do and why? Not what would I do, not what would your friend would do, not what is optimal in the grand scheme of GTO. It's what you would do in that moment and why. All right, so let's get into it. So here we have Fausto. It's actually based on a real person. Fausto, if you're watching this, we love you. He's a young Hispanic male. He's wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, so kind of looks like the prototypical really good poker player. First things first, if you see somebody that's dressed like a poker player, doesn't mean that they're actually a good poker player. It just means they're dressed like one. A lot of players beginner players get intimidated when they completely shouldn't. So that's the first thing. Fausto is very intently following the action at the table, so he's an aware player. He's been at the table for 30 minutes. Stakes are 2 5s, got 675 behind him. Now, our image should be generally unknown to Fausto since he sat down. You only have played one hand in which you raised pre-flop and took down the pot with a C-bet in position. So we got just over 700. Little information about Fausto. So first, Fausto is on the waiting list for the 5-10 game. So he's playing 2-5, but he wants to wait and is probably, just kind of bored waiting for 5-10 to happen. You can't say that much about that. I mean, sometimes you'll find that players, when they wait for a higher stake, so like let's say they're sitting it down at 2-5 waiting for 5-10, they might be a little bit more spewy because maybe the money doesn't mean that much. I've seen players literally lose like 3 or 4 stacks while they're waiting for the higher stakes, even though by losing 3 or 4 stacks, they essentially, gave away 2 or 3 buy-ins at that stakes. It's a whole other story. Fausto has been very aggressive in his 30 minutes at the table. He has entered all his pots with a raise, and his sizing is much larger than the average for the table. Okay, so he can be playing with sizing for a bunch of reasons. If we consider this player to be good, he could have an element doing something where I do. I artificially inflate the size of the pots because I believe that my bluffs are way more effective on the turn and river, just because a lot of these players, will be tough pre-flop in the sense that they'll call pre-flop, call flop, and then on the turn and river, they're kind of like, what did I get myself into? Fausto could be kind of creating that dynamic, or he can just be a very, loose, aggressive, straightforward player who's obviously going to add more aggression in his game. So observation 3, middle position player raised to 20, and Fausto 3-bet to 65 from the cutoff. Middle position player calls. Flop comes ace-jack 5. Player bets 60. Fausto makes it 150, and the middle position player went all in for an additional 425. Fausto thought about it for 30 seconds and folded. This could be a spot where he's, getting out of line, trying to take advantage of this player. Then this player all of a sudden comes along and jams, and probably is jamming with an actual hand. Fausto's wise enough to know that that's actually, probably a good spot to fold. Fausto raised in the big blind to 75 after 3 limps. He took down the pot without a call. So isolating the limpers from the big blind, kind of standard for a loose aggressive player. Could be doing that with a very wide range of hands. Probably doesn't think that most of his opponents are going to continue in that spot. And he just basically gets a free $17 or $18 the majority of the time. Observation 5, Fausto seems to like to overbet pots. He's also attacking smaller bet sizing, especially post-flop. So right now, it seems like Fausto is one of those standard attack weakness kind of bully, and attack weakness with sheer aggression, like all of us, and which I think is a phenomenal way to play live poker, and it's something a lot of players don't do. However, these players do have flaws in their game in the sense that they tend to sometimes do that too much, and you can pick certain spots to go after them. All right, so let's get into the hand. An ABC type player limps in middle position, and Fausto makes it 30 in the cutoff. It folds to you in the small blind, and you have Queen Jack. What would you do and why? Now, I believe this is such an interesting dynamic for a ton of reasons, and I want to call out the various reasons. First, we're not folding. We can't really fold unless maybe if you're a super beginner with no bankroll and you don't want to get into these weird kind of spots with an aggressive player, maybe, but there's a lot of value with Queen Jack in this situation. And understand, I really believe that you should take a personal approach to poker. So I don't know your financial circumstances. I don't know your propensity for tilt. I don't know if you have some issues psychologically with younger players in hoodies. Like, I don't really know what's going on. You need to take account when you play poker. When you play poker, it's different than someone else giving you advice. So it's important to identify that in this spot. But folding is probably not the best thing. So what can we say about this dynamic? First, a lot of players, we have to acknowledge that we're out of position against a really aggressive player. And I really do find that a lot of players look at Queen Jack preflop and they're like, wow, this has value. They snap call. And then they have no idea how to play the hand unless like the absolute nuts happens, right? So if all of a sudden it's like, 9, 10 of spades, everybody's an expert in how to play a hand. But most of the time when the board's like 2, 3, 6, like what do? Do you just check fold against this player that you know has the ability to like barrel with nothing? Like, is Queen Jack, does it have value against Mr. Fausto? Of course, but does it have value when the board is like 2, 6, 7, 3? Like, are you going to try to get tricky and get yourself into a spot where you fight an aggressive player for no reason? It creates what I call slippery slopes, meaning you really didn't have an actual plan for the hand, and your only plan is if you flop really well and that works out. So that's why for the majority of players, for the majority of players in this spot, I believe, and I don't know you can argue, what is right for you, and I feel free to defend yourself below. I want to have that discussion. But for most of you, you should be raising. And this is the reason why is, first, when Fausto makes it 30 in the cutoff, he's probably exploiting the ABC type player in middle position. Now, some of you might make the argument that because he's exploiting that player, that, Queen Jack has a lot of value against his range and so on and so forth. But the whole point is we're out of position against this really aggressive player. And if you're not comfortable dealing with those pot size and turns and those large bets, and you're only comfortable dealing with something, for most players, I think, it's better to raise in this spot because, one, you're probably exploiting the fact that Fausto is exploiting the ABC type player. So a good percentage of the time, what you're basically going to do is just get him to fold, and you're going to take down a smaller pot right then and there. But it's not a bad spot, right? Out of position with Queen Jack, fine. And then worst comes to worst, if he happens to call, Queen Jack it can play very well against the range of hands that he might potentially call you with in that spot. And you have way more assertion or way more power against a thinking player like Fausto when you make a C-bet on that flop when you raise, as opposed to just calling. Meaning when you call, he probably knows that you're not calling with a lot of hands that will, do well on a 2, 3, 6 board or something like that. He knows that you're likely to have more spec type hands. I believe him to be able to process that. So when you raise, you just have a way more initiative. And if you plan to take down the pot, you're way more likely to be believed if you actually raise pre. Now, some of you might have some altering considerations, but when I think about the decision tree of what could go wrong in this specific spot and this kind of player, especially if you're newer to the game, raising just has a lot more merits, because over the long run, it makes the play safer, and it's an easier path to profits. And sometimes for a lot of you, this channel is watched by so many different types of poker players. Some of you clearly have a deep understanding of the game, and you're discussing like what concepts are optimal and what's not optimal. And I really want to use these assignments as a way of showing that there isn't this, maybe there is, but when it comes to live poker and it comes to having the person in front of you and the dynamics there, and you know how much money's in your pocket, and you know what's going to happen if all of a sudden the flop doesn't work out for you and you don't know what to do, or you're going to fold on a lot of flops that don't, improve your hand. It's really important to see that there is a path that is right for you. And the whole point is to make a grounded, it's to back up what you're doing with actual logic. We can poke holes in the logic all we want, but the reality is if the logic is sound and it's correct for you and you can justify it, it's probably the right play for you at that specific moment. So I definitely think that just raising is the good example. I would also probably against Mr. Fausto be making my sizing a lot a lot more. Maybe sometimes I will do something tricky to like encourage him to call. Like I'm not talking about what I would do. I know maybe I'll do a series where I'm more focused on me. I think a good percentage of the time against Fausto, if me and him play for a longer period of time, I'm not always raising in that spot. You know, sometimes I'm making my sizing a little bit higher. Sometimes I'm making it a little bit more moderate. Maybe like sometimes I'll raise it to 80. Sometimes I'll probably be, when I raise, be making it somewhere between the neighborhood of 80 to about $1.40. I do really weird sizing stuff when I play live poker. A lot of this is because when I'm reading a player's behavior, I always like to play with the threshold of raising. So raise size doesn't exist in this optimal what is right to raise right now. I mean, like, what is right to raise in the grand scheme of things? Sometimes there's a specific moment where I look at a player and I'm like, listen, if I raise to 80, he's calling. If I raise to 150, he's definitely folding. And I'll just pick those based on how I pick up on that specific read. That's fine. I think a lot of players go nuts with bet sizing here of like, what is the optimal bet sizing? And it needs to be 95, it needs to be 102, and relax, calm down. Sometimes like the actual individual circumstance that you're in requires a certain amount that may be out of the norm of what you usually bet. Go ahead, do it. People aren't going to remember in live play when you're seeing 30 hands per hour. They have to have a lot of time to be able to pick up on the fact that you're raising a certain amount doing certain things and a certain amount doing others. This isn't online poker where you get like 1,000, you see so many freaking hands and you can pick up on those trends quickly. It takes some time, so you can have that exploitive element in your game in the beginning. So yeah, I'd be raising a good percentage of the time, 80, 140. Sometimes I'd call him and probably insult him because I know who this player is and it was based on a player. But I really believe that for most players watching this video, raising to probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 100, somewhere around 100 is going to be the best play for you, okay? So argue dispute below. Loving this series. Thanks again. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you subscribe. We are releasing between 2 to 3 videos every single week. Also, make sure you head over to schoolofcards.com/value. The link's below in the description. It's basically our value email list where I do random webinars for free once or twice a month. I also answer questions, submit hands, and we release videos that we don't always release on YouTube. So make sure you check out schoolofcards.com/value, enter your name and email, and I'll keep you up to date.